Imagine living in a world where taking a daily bath would be seen as strange, where soap was considered a luxury, and where even the richest families sometimes struggled to smell fresh. This wasn't the distant Middle Ages. It was Victorian Britain, just a little more than a century ago. We often picture the Victorians as elegant, proper, and refined. Ladies in lace gowns, gentlemen in polished suits, children with rosy cheeks. But behind the portraits and polished manners was a very different reality. Their cities reeked with smoke, sewage, and horse manure. Their clothing was layered, heavy, and hard to wash, and their approach to personal hygiene was, by our standards, completely shocking. In this series, we'll explore the strange, fascinating, and sometimes downright unpleasant truth about Victorian hygiene. Why did so many people avoid full baths? How did they deal with body odor without deodorant? What strange powders did they brush their teeth with? And why was cleanliness linked not only to health, but to morality and social status? Stay with me, because the story of Victorian hygiene isn't just about dirt. And soap. It's about culture, class, identity, and the surprising ways their struggles shaped the habits we still practice today. So, if you've ever wondered what life really smelled like in the age of Queen Victoria, or why something as simple as washing could be so complicated, you're about to find out. In the Victorian era, something as ordinary as soap was not simply a bar resting on a washstand. It was a marker of wealth, status, and even morality. To us today, soap is an everyday item, bought without much thought and used freely. But in the 19th century, it was far more than just a cleaning tool. It was a luxury, a statement, and sometimes even a symbol of progress. When we imagine the great cities of the Victorian age, with their foggy streets, horse-drawn carriages, and elegant women in long skirts, it is easy to forget how rare true cleanliness really was. Soap, plain as it sounds, played a starring role in separating the wealthy from the poor, the refined from the ordinary, and the admired from the ignored. For much of early Victorian society, soap was expensive. It was not mass-produced in the way it is today. Instead, it was made in smaller quantities, often by local soap makers or through labor-intensive processes that kept costs high. A simple bar could take weeks to cure and required ingredients that were not cheap, fats or oils combined with lye, a caustic substance that was difficult to produce safely. Large companies had not yet perfected the art of making soap affordable for everyone. As a result, soap was often found only in the homes of wealthier families, and its presence was a quiet but powerful reminder of privilege. To own and use soap regularly meant that one could afford both the product and the water needed to use it properly. For the poor living in cramped city housing, water itself was not guaranteed. Many had to fetch it from public pumps or wells, carry it upstairs, and heat it over coal fires before they could even think of washing. Soap, therefore, was not just a bar for cleaning. It represented the effort and resources of an entire household. A wealthy family with servants could have buckets of hot water brought up at will, basins filled, and bars of soap neatly placed beside them. A poor family, however, might only use water sparingly, and soap might be reserved for clothes or special occasions rather than daily use on the body. The link between soap and class was so strong that it began to shape how people judged one another. Cleanliness became associated with respectability. A person who smelled fresh, wore clean linen, and appeared polished was assumed to be disciplined, moral, and of higher status. Meanwhile, those with dirty clothes, greasy hair, or unwashed hands were looked down upon, even when their poverty made such conditions unavoidable. This created a cruel cycle. The poor were often too poor to afford soap, but they were also criticized for being dirty, as if their lack of soap were a personal failure rather than a social reality. We can imagine the scene in a Victorian drawing room. A middle-class hostess proudly greets her guests, offering them refreshments in a space that smells faintly of lavender soap and polished wood. On the washstand in the guest bedroom sits a bar of scented soap, perhaps wrapped in fine paper. Its presence tells visitors that the family is not only clean but also cultured. In contrast, a working-class family in the East End of London might have only a single bar of rough brown soap used for everything: washing bodies, scrubbing floors, and cleaning laundry. It was harsh on the skin, smelled strongly of lye, and wore down quickly. For them, soap was not a luxury but a tool stretched to its limits. Advertising also began to play a role in the Victorian understanding of soap. By the mid-19th century, companies like Pears were creating some of the first branded soaps, complete with packaging, slogans, and even celebrity endorsements. Pears soap, in particular, marketed itself as refined, pure, and almost medicinal. It was no longer just a bar to clean with. It was a product that claimed to bring beauty, health, and sophistication. The famous Pears advertisements showed rosy-cheeked children and elegant women, their complexions glowing thanks to the product. These images reinforce the idea that soap was tied not only to cleanliness, but also to attractiveness, respect, and even morality. If you used soap, you were not just clean, you were virtuous. The moral connection is especially important. Victorian society often linked outward appearance with inner character. To be clean was to be disciplined, respectable, and virtuous. To be dirty was to be lazy, immoral, or careless. Soap, in this way, became a symbol of self-control. A young woman who washed regularly and smelled of rose-scented soap was praised not only for her beauty but also for her character. A man who presented himself clean-shaven and fresh was seen as reliable and respectable. The truth, that soap was more available to the wealthy, was often ignored. Cleanliness was presented as a choice, when in reality, it was a privilege. At the same time, public health campaigns began to highlight the importance of soap. With cholera outbreaks and other diseases spreading rapidly in crowded cities, reformers saw cleanliness as a way to fight illness. Pamphlets encouraged families to wash more often, and charities sometimes distributed soap to the poor. Still, these efforts were limited, and the gap between those who could afford regular washing and those who could not remained wide. Soap was praised as a tool of health, but access to it was still uneven. The fascination with soap even extended to language and literature. Writers described characters in terms of their cleanliness or lack of it, using soap as a shorthand for class and respectability. In novels, a heroine might be praised for her delicate, clean hands, while a villain was described as greasy or unwashed. The presence or absence of soap was not just practical, it was symbolic, shaping how people understood each other. As the Victorian era progressed, soap did slowly become more affordable. Advances in industrial production and the use of new ingredients allowed larger companies to produce it in greater quantities. By the late 19th century, soap was beginning to enter more homes, and with it, the idea that daily washing was a standard expectation. Still, the old associations lingered. Even as more people gained access, soap remained tied to the values of refinement, morality, and respectability that had defined it earlier. Reflecting on this now, it is almost astonishing to realize that something so ordinary carried such heavy meaning. A simple bar of soap could reveal class, suggest character, and even influence health. In the flickering light of a Victorian household, it was far more than a cleansing tool. It was a symbol of who you were and how you wanted to be seen. To us today, it may be a small thing. To them, it was a quiet revolution, one bar at a time. In the Victorian era, the idea of bathing daily would have seemed strange, unnecessary, and even wasteful to most people. Today, we take showers almost without thinking, a quick part of the morning routine before work or school. But in the 19th century, a full bath was something rare, complicated, and often reserved for special occasions rather than a regular habit. This was not only because of cost, but also because of practicality, beliefs about health, and the sheer difficulty of preparing the water and space needed for a proper bath. For many Victorians, the greatest challenge was access to water. Running water was not something that most homes had until the later part of the century, and even then it was usually limited to wealthier families living in newer, modern houses. For the majority, water had to be fetched from pumps, wells, or cisterns, carried upstairs in heavy buckets, and then heated over a fire before it could be poured into a tub. To fill even a small bath took time, fuel, and effort, which meant it was not something that could be done casually every morning. For poorer families crowded into city tenements, the idea of heating dozens of gallons of water just for washing was almost unimaginable. Instead, people relied on more modest forms of cleaning. A bowl of water on a washstand might be used for rinsing the face, hands, and neck. This was known as a sponge bath or strip wash, and it was much more common than full immersion. It required less water and could be done quickly, even in cramped rooms. Washing hands and face was seen as polite and necessary, especially before meals or when meeting others, but washing the entire body was often considered excessive. There was also the question of health. At the time, many people believed that bathing too often could actually be dangerous. Medical theories were still developing, and while some doctors encouraged cleanliness, others warned that frequent bathing could weaken the body, open the pores to illness, or even cause fevers. Cold baths, on the other hand, were sometimes prescribed as a kind of treatment, believed to strengthen the body and improve discipline. But these were often more like shocks to the system than acts of hygiene. Warm baths for comfort or relaxation were viewed with suspicion, sometimes linked to indulgence or even immorality. For wealthier families, bathing was still a challenge, though they had more resources to manage it. Some houses had portable tubs, large metal basins that could be carried into a room and filled with water. Servants would heat the water over the kitchen fire and carry it up in buckets, pouring it carefully until the tub was full. After the bath, the water had to be emptied again, bucket by bucket. Even in comfortable homes, this process was labor-intensive, and so it was not repeated daily. A weekly bath was more common, and for some, even less frequent. Public bathhouses began to appear in the mid-19th century, offering people in crowded cities a chance to bathe more thoroughly. These facilities, often run by charities or reformers, provided large communal tubs or private cubicles where water could be drawn. They were intended to improve public health, especially among the poor, who otherwise had little access to proper washing. But even here, regular bathing was far from daily. A visit to the bathhouse might be a weekly ritual or even monthly, depending on one's schedule and finances. It is important to remember that standards of smell and cleanliness were different as well. People were more accustomed to the natural odors of daily life. Sweat from work, smoke from fires, or the scent of clothing worn repeatedly before washing. Rather than expecting constant freshness, Victorians often covered smells with perfume, powders, or fresh clothing. Clean linen, for example, was considered one of the most important signs of hygiene, even if the body beneath had not been recently washed. A man in a crisp white shirt and a woman in a freshly laundered chemise could appear respectable, regardless of how often they bathed. The association of bathing with morality also shaped how people thought about it. Too much attention to the body was sometimes frowned upon, as if it suggested vanity or indulgence. Modesty was a strong value, and immersing oneself naked in water, even in private, could feel improper to some. Bathing was sometimes framed as an activity for the sick, the weak, or those in need of treatment, rather than for everyone. A healthy person did not necessarily see the need for frequent full baths, especially when a simple rinse at the washstand could suffice. At the same time, reformers began to push for more regular bathing as cities grew and public health crises worsened. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other diseases forced people to reconsider the role of cleanliness in preventing illness. Doctors, like Florence Nightingale in hospitals and public health officials in cities, began to emphasize the importance of washing not just hands and faces, but whole bodies. Slowly, attitudes shifted, and by the end of the Victorian period, bathing was becoming more normalized. But in the earlier decades it was still unusual to think of a daily bath as necessary. We can picture a typical Victorian family's routine. In the morning, children might splash water on their faces from a shared basin, while adults wiped their hands and necks with a damp cloth. Once a week, perhaps on Saturday night, a larger bath would be prepared. A portable tub would be brought into the kitchen or scullery, filled with heated water and used by family members one after another. The father might go first, followed by the mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the last child stepped into the tub, the water was far from clean. Yet this was accepted as normal, because the effort of preparing fresh water each time was too great. The wealthy, of course, had more options. Some had bathrooms fitted with new plumbing, especially in the latter half of the century. These bathrooms were still rare and considered a luxury, complete with porcelain tubs, tiled floors, and sometimes even running hot water. But such innovations were not common until late in the Victorian age, and most people never experienced them at all. For the majority, bathing remained a chore, not a daily comfort. Looking back, the Victorian bathing problem reminds us how much of what we take for granted depends on technology and culture. To them, the idea of pouring gallons of hot water into a tub every morning would have seemed extravagant, perhaps even foolish. To us, the thought of going weeks without a bath feels unthinkable. The difference lies in access, expectation, and the slow shift of attitudes over time. In the end, bathing in the Victorian era was less about daily habit and more about occasion. It was a planned event requiring preparation, effort, and resources. For some, it was a rare luxury. For others, a public necessity. And for many, it was simply too much trouble. Yet out of these challenges came the beginnings of modern hygiene, as reformers, doctors, and innovators slowly pushed society toward the idea that cleanliness was not only respectable, but also essential for health. In the Victorian era, one of the more curious beliefs about health and hygiene was the idea that cold water could cure almost anything. Doctors, reformers, and even some religious leaders promoted what came to be known as the cold water cure, or hydrotherapy. To modern ears, the thought of plunging into a freezing bath or having cold water poured over your body every morning sounds more like punishment than medicine. But in the 19th century, many people genuinely believed that cold water held the power to cleanse not only the body but also the mind and spirit. The fascination with cold water began in part as a reaction against the fear of warm bathing. Warm baths were sometimes associated with weakness, indulgence, or even immorality. Warmth was thought to open the pores and make the body vulnerable to illness. Cold water, on the other hand, was believed to strengthen the body, tighten the skin, and harden the spirit. A brisk, cold plunge was described as invigorating, a way to shake off laziness and discipline the body into health. It was not just about hygiene, it was about building character. Doctors and health reformers recommended cold water for a wide range of ailments. Headaches, fevers, digestive troubles, nervous conditions, and even bad tempers were said to be cured by regular cold baths. Patients might be instructed to step into icy tubs, have buckets of water poured over them, or even be wrapped in cold, wet sheets. The shock of the chill was thought to stimulate the circulation, clear the mind, and restore balance to the body. While some people swore by the results, others no doubt dreaded the ordeal but endured it because of the authority of their doctors. Hydrotherapy institutions, often called water cure establishments, sprang up across Britain and beyond. These were retreat-like centers where patients could spend days or weeks undergoing treatments with cold water. Visitors might walk barefoot on dewy grass at dawn, take alternating cold and lukewarm showers, or be submerged in chilly baths for prescribed intervals. These practices were combined with fresh air, exercise, and plain diets, forming part of a larger movement toward natural living. For wealthy Victorians, such establishments became fashionable, offering not only supposed cures, but also a chance to escape the grime of the city and indulge in a new kind of health tourism. For ordinary people, The cold water cure was less glamorous but still influential. Parents were sometimes encouraged to toughen their children by splashing them with cold water in the mornings, a practice that was believed to build resilience. Soldiers and factory workers were also advised to rinse themselves in cold water before beginning the day, though in many cases this was more wishful thinking than practical advice, given the difficulty of accessing clean water. Still, the idea of cold water as both hygienic and morally strengthening filtered through society, shaping how people understood health. There was also a strong moral and religious element to the cold water cure. Many reformers saw it as a way to control the passions of the body. Cold water was linked to purity and discipline, while warm indulgence was tied to sin and weakness. Some religious groups even promoted daily cold baths as a form of spiritual training, a way to harden the flesh against temptation. In this sense, water was not only a medical tool but also a moral one, reinforcing the Victorian values of self-control, moderation, and hard work. Despite its popularity, the cold water cure was not always pleasant or effective. Many patients found it uncomfortable, and for those who were already weak or ill, cold immersion could be dangerous. There were stories of people fainting from shock or becoming even more unwell after treatments. But such cases did little to dampen the enthusiasm of its supporters, who insisted that any discomfort was part of the healing process. To suffer through the cold was to prove one's strength, and those who recovered were held up as evidence of its success. In everyday homes, the cold water cure influenced simple habits. Morning washing, even without a full bath, often involved cold water. A basin filled with chilly liquid from the pump or well was used to splash the face, rinse the hands, and perhaps wipe the chest or arms. This was seen not only as refreshing, but also as healthy. The shock of the cold water was thought to wake the body, prepare it for the day, and ward off illness. While few people embraced full cold plunges at home, the idea of starting the day with cold water became part of daily routine for many. We can imagine the scene in a Victorian household. A father, determined to follow the latest health advice, fills a basin with cold water and splashes his face vigorously, gasping at the shock but convinced it makes him stronger. His children are encouraged to do the same, though they squeal and protest at the icy sensation. A mother, more skeptical, may prefer to wash with warmer water when she can, but even she cannot ignore the growing belief that cold water is good for the family. The practice becomes part of the rhythm of life, even when it is dreaded. The cold water cure also reflects the broader Victorian fascination with self-improvement. This was an age of discipline, reform, and moral seriousness. Just as people believed in working hard, saving money, and controlling their behavior, they also believed in controlling their bodies through practices like cold bathing. To endure discomfort for the sake of health or morality was seen as a virtue. In this way, the cold water cure was not only about hygiene but also about culture. It fit neatly into the values of the age. By the end of the century, as medical science advanced, the cold water cure lost some of its authority. Germ theory and modern medicine shifted attention to cleanliness, disinfection, and proper bathing with soap and warm water rather than shock treatments with cold water. Yet the legacy of hydrotherapy remained, with echoes in modern practices like cold showers, ice baths for athletes, and spa treatments that still promise to refresh and invigorate. Looking back, the Victorian obsession with cold water may seem odd, even extreme, but it reveals how people sought meaning and order in their lives through the simplest of things. Water, the most basic element, became a tool for health, morality, and self-control. To immerse oneself in cold water was to embrace not only discomfort, but also discipline, a reflection of the values that shaped the age. And so, the cold water cure reminds us that hygiene in the Victorian era was never just about washing dirt away. It was about belief, character, and the quest for health in a world still discovering how the body truly worked. To step into a cold bath was to step into an idea, one that promised strength and purity, even if it left you shivering. In the Victorian era, the ritual of bathing was not just rare but often shared, and this practice reveals much about daily life at the time. The idea of each family member enjoying a fresh tub of hot water simply did not exist for most people. Water was heavy to carry, expensive to heat, and difficult to dispose of once used. Because of these challenges, many families developed a system. They all used the same bathwater. It sounds unpleasant to us now, but for Victorians, it was a practical solution to a very real problem. The process began with preparation. A large portable tub, often made of metal or heavy wood, would be placed in the kitchen or scullery, the part of the house with the most access to water and heat. Servants or family members would spend a long time hauling buckets from the well, pump, or communal water source. Then, coal or wood had to be burned to heat the water, often in kettles or pots that were emptied into the tub one by one. To fill even half a tub could take hours of effort, and the cost of fuel was significant. It was no wonder that once the water was in place, the family wanted to make the most of it. The order of bathing usually reflected hierarchy. The head of the household, most often the father, was given the first chance to bathe. His privilege meant he enjoyed the cleanest water, the most comfortable temperature, and the longest time to soak. After him came the mother, then older children, and finally the youngest. By the time the last child stepped in, the water was often cloudy, lukewarm, and far from inviting. Yet this was the accepted pattern, and no one thought it unusual. It was part of the rhythm of family life, shaped by necessity rather than preference. For the poor, even this arrangement could be rare. Some families might only manage a shared bath once a week, or even less often, with the children washed more quickly or with smaller basins of water instead of the full tub. Laundry and bathing competed for the same resources, so choices had to be made about whether water and fuel were better spent on washing clothes or washing bodies. In crowded city tenements, where multiple families lived in one building, the challenges grew even greater. Some households shared tubs with neighbors, while others relied entirely on public baths if they wanted a proper soak. The shared bathwater custom also highlights the very different standards of cleanliness at the time. People accepted that water would not be perfectly fresh for each person, and the smell or appearance of the bath by the end did not cause the same disgust it might today. Daily life already included exposure to smoke, sweat, and dirt, so expectations were lower. To step into warm water, even if it had already been used, was still a luxury compared to a quick cold wash from a basin. There was also a social and moral dimension to the practice. Bathing was often associated with modesty and discipline, and sharing water fit into this worldview. Families saw it as efficient and practical, not as unsanitary. In some rural areas, where resources were especially scarce, children might be scrubbed in a single large basin in quick succession, the goal being more about removing visible dirt than achieving a modern sense of freshness. The act of bathing together, in turns, reinforced family bonds and hierarchy as much as it cleaned the skin. We can imagine a typical Saturday night in a Victorian working-class home. The tub is dragged in, water is carried and heated, and finally the father lowers himself into the steaming basin, sighing with relief after a week of labor. Once he is done, the mother takes her turn, perhaps quickly, so that the children can follow. The older children splash in the now cloudy water, while the younger ones are scrubbed quickly by their mother's hands. By the end, the tub is heavy, dirty, and cooled, and the water must be disposed of, another task requiring effort. Yet, for all the trouble, the ritual marks the end of the week, a sign that the family has done its best to stay clean within their means. For wealthier families, the situation was somewhat different. They, too, often relied on portable tubs, but their servants managed the process, and they could afford more frequent changes of water. Still, even in upper-class households, multiple people sometimes used the same bathwater, especially children. It was not until the later Victorian years, with the spread of plumbing and dedicated bathrooms, that the idea of fresh water for every bath began to emerge among the elite. Until then, shared water was simply part of the normal experience. Public commentary sometimes criticized the practice, especially as reformers began to push for better hygiene in the cities. Writers described the health risks of dirty water and the spread of disease, though germ theory was not yet fully accepted. Charities and health advocates argued for public baths where families could bathe in cleaner conditions, and some even provided vouchers or free access for the poor. But the reality remained that in most homes, water was too precious to waste, and sharing was the only way forward. The shared bathwater tradition also created cultural sayings and stories. The phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," is often said to have come from this time, reflecting the idea that by the end of a bathing sequence the water was so murky that a small child could almost be overlooked in it. While this may be more legend than fact, it captures the truth of how dirty the water could become after several uses. Looking back, the practice of sharing bathwater is a reminder of how difficult life could be without the conveniences we take for granted. Today, we turn a tap and fill a tub in minutes, with no thought to the cost of water or fuel. In Victorian homes, the process required labor, planning, and sacrifice. Cleanliness was not a simple choice, but a complicated task, and the solutions people found, like shared bathwater, were shaped by the limits of their world. And yet, despite the murky water and the effort involved, there must have been moments of relief and comfort. Even a once-a-week bath, shared though it was, offered a chance to relax tired muscles, wash away some of the grime of city or farm life, and feel renewed. It was not perfect, but it was meaningful. In a world where hygiene was a constant challenge, the tub in the kitchen became a symbol of effort, family, and survival. Did you know? In the Victorian era, one of the greatest challenges of daily life was not simply keeping clean, but dealing with what happened after the body had finished its work. Toilets as we know them today were not yet standard, and for much of the 19th century, most families, rich and poor alike, relied on chamber pots, backyard privies, or the services of night soil collectors. It was a problem that touched every household, every street, and eventually entire cities. And it was a problem that smelled, quite literally, unavoidable. For those living in houses, whether large or small, the chamber pot was the most common solution. These were simple vessels, often made of ceramic or metal, placed under the bed or hidden in a cabinet. At night, when it was inconvenient or dangerous to go outside, family members would use the pot. In the morning, it had to be emptied. For the wealthy, servants often performed this unpleasant duty, carrying the contents away discreetly. For the poor, it was one more chore of daily life, made worse by the lack of private places to dispose of the waste. In crowded tenements, pots might be emptied into shared yards, drains, or even out of windows onto the street. Privies, outdoor toilets, usually wooden seats above a pit, were another solution. In rural areas, these could be functional if not pleasant, as the earth absorbed much of the waste. In cities, however, privies often overflowed. The pits beneath them filled faster than they could be cleared, and the smell spread through alleys and courtyards. During hot summers, the stench was nearly unbearable. Worse still, the waste seeped into the soil and contaminated wells, spreading disease among families who relied on the same water for drinking and cooking. Enter the night soil collectors, men whose job was to remove human waste from pits and cesspools. Under cover of darkness, they would shovel the contents into carts and haul it away, sometimes to be dumped outside the city or even used as fertilizer. Their work was dangerous, filthy, and often ridiculed, yet essential. Without them, the city would drown in its own waste. These men occupied one of the lowest rungs of Victorian society, shunned for their smell and their work, yet relied upon by everyone. It is difficult for us today to imagine a world where the removal of waste was performed by hand, but in Victorian Britain, it was part of daily reality. The problem was especially severe in London, where the population exploded during the 19th century. By the middle of the century, millions of people lived in cramped housing, each producing waste with nowhere sanitary to put it. Chamber pots were emptied into gutters, cesspools overflowed, and rivers became dumping grounds. The Thames, once a working waterway, became an open sewer. Its waters grew black and foul, carrying waste and disease through the heart of the capital. For Victorians living near the river, the smell was overwhelming, and the health consequences were devastating. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery became common, killing thousands and frightening entire communities. Despite this, habits were slow to change. Emptying chamber pots into the street had been common for centuries, and in some areas it was almost ritualized. People would shout warnings before tipping the contents out of windows, though the unfortunate passerby might still be caught beneath. Reformers and public health officials began campaigning for better sanitation, but progress required both money and new technology. For most families, chamber pots and privies remained the only options for much of the century. We can picture a Victorian morning in a working-class neighborhood. In the narrow courtyards behind rows of houses, chamber pots are being emptied, their contents splashing into already overflowing privies. Children play nearby, the smell inescapable, while mothers scold them for running too close. A night soil collector, bent and weary, pushes his cart down the street, greeted with wrinkled noses but also quiet relief that someone is handling the waste. Meanwhile, in a wealthier home across town, a servant discreetly removes a chamber pot from under a carved bed frame, hurrying it to a yard where it will be emptied. Cleanliness in the morning begins with this task, no matter one's class. The connection between waste and disease slowly became better understood. Though germ theory was not yet widely accepted in the early Victorian years, the link between filth and illness was hard to ignore. When cholera outbreaks swept through crowded neighborhoods, reformers pointed to poor sanitation as the cause. The miasma theory, which suggested that bad air from waste caused sickness, pushed authorities to act, even if they did not yet fully understand bacteria. Public pressure grew, especially after the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of the Thames became so overpowering that Parliament could no longer ignore it. This crisis eventually led to the creation of London's massive sewer system, one of the greatest engineering feats of the age. Before that transformation, however, daily life remained shaped by the chamber pot and the privy. Even the wealthy, with their larger homes and gardens, still relied on these methods until plumbing reached their neighborhoods. Water closets, early flush toilets, were invented during the Victorian era, but they were expensive and slow to spread. For most people, the old routines continued. Children grew up familiar with the sight and smell of chamber pots, and families organized their mornings around the task of emptying and scrubbing them. The presence of waste shaped how people thought about hygiene. Cleanliness was not just about washing with soap or bathing occasionally. It was also about controlling smells and managing the unpleasant necessities of life. Perfumes, powders, and fresh clothing all helped mask the reality that chamber pots sat under beds and privies waited in backyards. Respectable households took pride in how discreetly and efficiently they could manage this task, just as much as in how clean their linen was. Looking back, the reliance on chamber pots and night soil collectors feels shocking, even grotesque. But in the context of the Victorian world, it was normal, expected, and necessary. People did not have the luxury of flushing away their waste with the turn of a handle. Instead, they lived with it, smelled it, and managed it as best they could. The solutions may seem crude, but they were part of the slow march toward modern sanitation. Without those collectors and those endless morning rituals, the great cities of the Victorian age could not have functioned at all. In the end, the chamber pot and the night soil man remind us of the realities beneath the elegance of the era. Behind the polished drawing rooms and fashionable gowns lay a constant struggle with waste, a problem that touched everyone, rich and poor alike. It was dirty, it was smelly, and it was unavoidable. Yet out of this mess came pressure for change, leading to the clean, efficient systems we rely on today. By the summer of 1858, London had grown into one of the largest and busiest cities in the world, But beneath the noise of horse-drawn carriages and the glitter of gas lamps was a problem no one could ignore. The Thames River, flowing right through the heart of the city, had become a vast open sewer. For years, people had been pouring their waste into it. Chamber pots emptied, cesspits drained, factory runoff dumped without care. As the population swelled, the river absorbed more and more filth, until the heat of that fateful summer brought it all to the surface in what came to be called the Great Stink. The smell was overwhelming. Newspapers described it as unbearable, a stench so strong it seemed to seep into every street and every building near the water. People along the riverbank covered their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or peppermint oil, desperate for relief. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn tight, and still the odor crept in. Even those who had lived in London all their lives, accustomed to dirt and grime, found themselves shocked at the sheer intensity of the smell. It was not just unpleasant, it was suffocating. Parliament, located right beside the Thames, found itself paralyzed. Politicians tried to carry on debates, but the stench filled the chamber until they could barely speak without gagging. At one point, curtains were soaked in lime chloride in an attempt to block the odor, but it was useless. Some members fled altogether, unable to remain in the building. The Great Stink had reached the highest levels of government, and it could no longer be dismissed as a nuisance of the poor. For once, the suffering was shared by the powerful, and that made all the difference. The public reaction was immediate. Ordinary citizens who had endured the smell of waste for years now found their complaints echoed by those in authority. The press reported on the crisis with sensational detail, describing the Thames as a fermenting sewer and warning that the city as health was at risk. Panic about disease spread quickly. Though germ theory was not yet fully accepted, people feared the miasma, the bad air that was thought to cause illness. If the stench was this strong, many believed, then the danger must be deadly. The memory of cholera outbreaks still haunted the city, and everyone worried that another wave of sickness might be brewing. The truth was not far off. The polluted river was indeed a breeding ground for disease, carrying bacteria that spread cholera and other deadly infections. Entire neighborhoods had already suffered in earlier epidemics, and the Great Stink forced people to acknowledge the connection between waste and health. The sheer scale of the crisis made it impossible to ignore. London, the proud capital of an empire, could not continue to let its citizens live beside a poisoned river. The crisis sparked action. Engineers and reformers had long argued for better sanitation, but political will had been lacking. Now, with Parliament itself unable to function because of the smell, there was no choice but to act. Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant civil engineer, was given the task of designing a new sewer system for the city. His plan was ambitious: miles of underground brick tunnels to carry waste away from the Thames, vast pumping stations, and a system that would redirect sewage downstream where it could no longer poison the capital. It was one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century, and it changed the city forever. Construction began soon after, and over the following years, the sewer system transformed London. Streets became cleaner, outbreaks of disease less frequent, and the Thames slowly began to recover. For many Londoners, the difference was dramatic. The Great Stink had been a moment of humiliation, but it also marked the beginning of modern sanitation. It showed what could happen when the realities of daily life became too overwhelming to ignore, and when public pressure and political necessity finally aligned. Yet, for all its impact, daily life during the Great Stink was unforgettable for those who lived through it. Imagine walking along the embankment in the heat of July, the river below reduced to a sluggish brown flow of sewage. The air is thick, almost tangible, pressing against your skin and filling your lungs with every breath. Vendors selling fruit or bread find their goods spoiled by the smell, while families close their windows despite the heat, preferring stifling air to the river's fumes. Children hold their noses as they play, though even laughter cannot escape the odor. Everywhere you go, the stink follows, a reminder that the city itself is drowning in its own waste. The event became a turning point not only for London, but for cities around the world. Other growing industrial centers took note, recognizing that modern urban life required modern sanitation. The lesson of the Great Stink was simple but profound. Without clean water and proper waste disposal, no city could thrive. It was a truth that shaped public health policy for generations to come. Looking back now, the Great Stink of 1858 may sound almost humorous in its absurdity, but for Victorians, it was deadly serious. It threatened their health, disrupted their government, and revealed the dark underbelly of industrial progress. Behind the grandeur of empire and the elegance of Victorian fashion lay a city choking on its own filth. And yet, out of that crisis came innovation, determination, and one of the most remarkable public works projects of its time. The Great Stink reminds us that progress often comes only when problems can no longer be ignored. It took a river so foul it drove politicians from their chambers to spur real change, but the result was a cleaner, healthier city. Today, when we turn on a tap or flush a toilet, we rarely think of the suffering that led to these conveniences. But in the sweltering summer of 1858, Londoners learned that sanitation was not a luxury. It was a necessity, one that could mean the difference between life and death. In the Victorian era, the matter of oral hygiene was as curious and complicated as everything else about cleanliness. Today, brushing our teeth twice a day with minty toothpaste feels so ordinary we hardly think about it. But in the 19th century, toothpaste as we know it didn't really exist. Instead, Victorians used a mixture of powders, pastes, and improvised remedies to clean their teeth, often with results that were far from pleasant. The problem was not just access to good cleaning products, but also the fact that dentistry itself was a developing science. As a result, bad breath and decayed teeth were common companions in everyday life. Tooth powder was the most common product used. It usually came in small tins or jars, sometimes sold by chemists and sometimes made at home. Ingredients varied widely. A simple version might include chalk, crushed seashells, or baking soda to act as an abrasive, scraping away stains and food particles. Some added charcoal, salt, or herbs like mint or cloves for freshness. For those who could afford it, tooth powder might be scented with oils or flavored with spices to make the experience less harsh. But many versions were gritty, unpleasant to taste, and rough on the teeth. Used too often, the abrasives could wear down enamel rather than preserve it. Applying tooth powder required a brush or cloth, but toothbrushes were not yet widespread in the early Victorian years. Many people simply wrapped a rag around a finger, dipped it in the powder, and rubbed it against their teeth. Others used twigs, chewed until the ends frayed into bristles. By the middle of the century, toothbrushes became more common, often with handles made from bone and bristles made from animal hair. These brushes were not always hygienic themselves, as the bristles collected bacteria and could not be easily cleaned. Still, they represented a step forward, and by the late Victorian years, toothbrushes were becoming part of respectable households. Despite these efforts, bad breath, often called foul breath or offensive breath in Victorian writing, was a constant problem. Diet played a role, with heavy meats, onions, and limited access to fresh produce contributing to odors. More significantly, untreated dental problems meant many adults had rotting teeth, infected gums, or abscesses that caused persistent smells. Dentistry was expensive, and poor families often had no access to it at all. A toothache could linger for weeks or months until the tooth simply fell out or was pulled by an untrained hand. Pain was common, and smiles were often incomplete. The wealthy sometimes turned to early dentists who advertised their services in newspapers and pamphlets. Some offered cleaning, polishing, and even false teeth made from ivory or porcelain. Others were less reputable, promising miracle powders or tonics that did little good. Tooth extraction was the most common solution to pain, often done without anesthesia or with only alcohol to dull the senses. The image of a dentist yanking out a tooth with forceps while a patient gripped the chair in agony was not far from reality. Preventive care, as we know it today, was rare. Still, Victorians cared about the appearance of their teeth. White, clean teeth were associated with health, youth, and attractiveness, while blackened or missing teeth were a source of shame. Some people used whitening powders made from harsh chemicals, including acids that stripped away stains but also damaged the teeth. Others chewed herbs like parsley or cloves to freshen the breath, or carried small boxes of mints to mask odors during social gatherings. Perfume might cover the body, but when people spoke, the truth of their dental health was hard to hide. Literature of the time often reflected these concerns. Characters in novels were described by their teeth as much as their eyes or hair. A heroine's white smile was a sign of beauty and purity, while a villain's yellow or rotting teeth hinted at corruption. Writers used dental health as a shorthand for character, just as they did with cleanliness of the body. The cultural link between clean teeth and moral worth was strong, even if the reality of maintaining them was difficult. For children, tooth powder was sometimes considered too harsh, and parents relied instead on simple rinses with water or herbal solutions. But childhood was no guarantee of health. Sweets were becoming increasingly available thanks to cheaper sugar, and children often suffered early tooth decay. The sight of young children with blackened or missing teeth was not uncommon, and it reflected the broader challenges of balancing diet, hygiene, and health in a rapidly industrializing society. We can imagine a Victorian morning routine. A young woman in a middle-class home sits at her dressing table, dipping her toothbrush into a small pot of chalky powder. She scrubs carefully, the gritty taste unpleasant, but she knows the effort is important. Her maid clears away the basin afterward, leaving behind the faint smell of mint and chalk. Meanwhile, in a poorer neighborhood, a boy wipes his teeth with a rag dipped in salt, grimacing at the sting on his gums. His family cannot afford powder or brushes, but he does what he can. Across town, a wealthy gentleman visits his dentist, who scrapes tartar from his teeth with metal tools, reminding him to use his expensive imported powder daily. In each case, the goal is the same: to fight decay, to appear respectable, to avoid the shame of bad breath. Despite these efforts, dentistry in the Victorian age remained largely reactive rather than preventive. People often endured pain until it was unbearable, then sought extraction as a final solution. False teeth were common, especially among the upper classes, who could afford sets made from porcelain or even human teeth purchased from grave robbers earlier in the century. To own a perfect smile, even if it was artificial, was a mark of wealth and refinement. For the poor, the loss of teeth was simply part of life, a reminder of how limited access to care could shape one's appearance. Looking back, the Victorian approach to dental hygiene shows us a world in transition. People valued clean teeth, but the tools and knowledge to achieve them were still developing. Tooth powder was a step toward modern toothpaste, but it was inconsistent and sometimes harmful. Toothbrushes were available, but not yet universal. Dentistry was emerging as a profession, but it was costly and painful. And so, bad breath and rotting teeth remained common, even as society judged them harshly. In the quiet hours of Victorian homes, tooth powder and brushes sat on washstands beside combs and basins. They were small signs of effort in a world where hygiene was hard to achieve. Every gritty scrub and every minty clove chewed was an attempt to meet the ideals of beauty and respectability. It was not easy, and it was not always successful, but it was part of the broader struggle of the age. To rise above the dirt, the smells, and the decay of daily life, and to appear at least on the surface clean and proper. The streets of Victorian cities were not the paved, orderly roads we might imagine when we think of elegant carriages rolling past gas lamps. They were, more often than not, filthy places filled with mud, waste, and the constant reminder that sanitation was still a dream in progress. To walk through London, Manchester, or any other rapidly growing industrial city in the 19th century was to experience dirt as part of everyday life. It clung to boots, splashed onto clothing, and even seeped into homes, carried on the hems of dresses and the wheels of carts. One of the most visible problems was mud, though mud was often a polite word for something worse. Streets were unpaved in many areas, and when it rained they turned into thick, sticky messes. Horses, which provided most of the city's transport, left manure behind in great quantities. Thousands of animals moved through London every day, each producing pounds of waste, and much of it stayed on the streets until it was pushed aside or ground into the earth. On a busy thoroughfare, it was said that a person could not walk a few steps without encountering horse dung. The mixture of rain, dirt, and manure created a slop that spattered onto skirts, boots, and carriage wheels, leaving pedestrians constantly battling stains and smells. Sweeps and street cleaners tried to keep up with the mess, but the volume was overwhelming. Crossing sweepers, poor men and children who cleared small paths across streets in exchange for coins, became familiar figures in cities. They used simple brooms to push aside the worst of the filth so that wealthier pedestrians could walk with some dignity. A lady in fine clothing might pause at the edge of a road, waiting for a sweeper to make a clean path so she could cross without ruining her hem. It was an imperfect system, but it reflected how much dirt was simply accepted as part of urban life. Garbage added to the problem. Without organized waste collection for much of the century, people often threw their rubbish into the streets. Food scraps, broken objects, and household waste accumulated in gutters. Rag pickers and scavengers picked through it for anything of value: bones for glue, cloth for rags, metal for resale, but much was left behind to rot. Dogs and rats scavenged as well, spreading scraps and disease. In working-class neighborhoods, alleys were especially notorious, with piles of refuse left until they decayed into foul-smelling heaps. Then there was the problem of sewage. Even before the Great Stink forced reforms, waste often found its way onto the streets, whether from overflowing privies or careless disposal of chamber pots. Gutters ran with dirty water, and in poorer districts, open drains carried both rainwater and human waste through the roads. In hot weather, the stench rose thick and heavy, mingling with the smoke from factories and coal fires. To breathe in a Victorian street was to inhale a mixture of dust, soot, dung, and decay. The clothing of the time made matters worse. Women's long skirts swept the ground as they walked, soaking up whatever lay on the cobblestones. A lady might carefully lift her hem with gloved hands, but unless she stayed indoors, it was almost impossible to avoid stains. Men fared little better. Their boots sank into the muck, leaving trails of mud behind them. Servants in wealthier homes spent hours cleaning boots and brushing dirt from garments, while poorer families simply lived with the grime, wearing clothes until they were unavoidably filthy. For children, the dirty streets were both a playground and a hazard. Many grew up playing in alleys or along gutters, their games surrounded by waste. They became accustomed to the smell and sight of decay, even as it endangered their health. Illnesses spread easily in such conditions, and reformers often pointed to the state of the streets as evidence of the need for better sanitation. But improvements came slowly, often hindered by the sheer size of growing cities and the lack of coordinated systems. Yet, amid all this filth, life went on. Vendors sold food from carts parked beside muddy roads, their wares exposed to dust and flies. Shoppers carried baskets through the mess, wiping their shoes before entering shops. Carriages splashed pedestrians with filthy water as they rolled by, causing endless complaints in newspapers and letters. Even the wealthy could not fully escape the problem. While their homes might be cleaner, their journeys across the city left them just as vulnerable to splashes and smells as anyone else. Some reformers saw the dirty streets as more than just a nuisance. They believed the filth reflected moral decay as well. To them, the cleanliness of a city was a sign of its discipline and virtue. Campaigns for street cleaning and sanitation were framed not only as matters of health but also of morality and respectability. Clean streets would not only reduce disease, they argued, but also encourage better behavior among citizens. The sight of refuse and waste was seen as degrading to society as a whole. Efforts to improve matters included more organized street sweeping, better paving, and eventually, more systematic waste collection. By the later decades of the century, some cities employed regular teams of workers to clean the roads, and new technologies like macadamized paving and proper drainage helped reduce the constant mud. But even then, horse manure remained a stubborn problem until motor vehicles replaced animal transport in the 20th century. If we try to imagine walking down a Victorian street, we can picture the uneven cobblestones, the splash of wheels through puddles of brown water, the cries of sweepers offering their services, and the constant need to watch one's step. A lady in white gloves might lift her skirts delicately, her nose wrinkling at the smell, while a working man trudged on without complaint, his boots caked in dirt. Children darted between carriages, their laughter mixing with the sound of hooves and the creak of wagons, unbothered by the filth around them. Life carried on in the middle of the muck, because there was no other choice. Looking back, the dirty streets of the Victorian era remind us how different everyday expectations of cleanliness once were. What we now consider intolerable was once ordinary. People adjusted their habits, their clothing, and even their standards of beauty to cope with the grime of their world. Cleanliness was prized inside the home, but the moment one stepped outside, the street itself became a reminder of the challenges of urban life. It was a struggle shared by all classes, one that shaped how Victorians understood both hygiene and civilization. Laundry in the Victorian era was not the simple push of a button we know today. It was one of the hardest, dirtiest, and most time-consuming chores in the household, especially for women and servants. Clean clothing was deeply tied to ideas of respectability and status, yet keeping it clean required endless hours of backbreaking labor. For middle and upper-class families, this burden often fell on maids and laundresses, while poorer women carried the load themselves, sometimes literally. The struggle of laundry gives us a window into the everyday reality of hygiene in the 19th century. The process usually began with sorting. Clothing was separated by fabric and level of dirtiness. Whites, linens, and undergarments required the most attention because they showed stains and odors easily. Colored fabrics were treated more carefully to avoid fading, while heavy garments like coats and dresses might only be brushed and aired rather than fully washed. Laundry day, often set aside once a week, was a dreaded occasion in many households because it meant hours of soaking, scrubbing, boiling, rinsing, wringing, and drying. For the wealthy, laundresses or scullery maids handled the task. In grand houses, laundry was done in special outbuildings or cellars, where great copper pots of water were heated over fires. The air in these spaces was hot, damp, and filled with the smell of soap and steam. Women bent over tubs with scrub boards, rubbing fabric until their hands were raw. Even with servants, the process was grueling, and the scale of it, sheets, towels, tablecloths, underclothes, and more, meant it was nearly constant. A large household might keep a staff of laundresses busy throughout the week, while smaller families dreaded the disruption of their weekly wash day. Poor families faced even greater difficulties. Without space for large tubs or constant access to clean water, many women hauled their laundry to communal washhouses or nearby rivers. Public washhouses became more common in the mid-Victorian years, offering hot water and basins for a small fee. These places were noisy and crowded, filled with women scrubbing side by side, sharing stories as they worked. For those without access, rivers and streams provided free water, but washing there meant bending over cold, dirty water for hours, exposed to the weather. It was exhausting, but it had to be done. Soap was essential but costly. Many poor households used homemade soap or harsh lye solutions that could damage fabric and skin. For the wealthy, scented soaps or finer powders promised gentler care, but even then, the results depended on hard labor. Scrubbing boards, introduced in the early 19th century, made the job somewhat easier, but they still demanded hours of muscle power. Clothes were boiled in great pots to kill lice and remove stains, then rinsed in cold water, wrung out by hand or with wringers, and finally hung to dry. Imagine the weight of soaking wet sheets or heavy woolen garments, and you can understand why laundry was dreaded. Drying was another challenge, especially in cities. Without open fields or large gardens, clotheslines were strung in narrow courtyards or across alleys. Clothes hung from windows, swaying above the muddy streets, sometimes picking up soot and smells from chimneys and factories. In winter, drying indoors meant draping laundry across chairs and railings, filling the house with dampness. The work did not end when the clothes were dry. Everything had to be ironed as well. Heavy, flat irons, heated on stoves, were used to press garments, smoothing them into respectability. This added yet another stage of heat and labor to an already exhausting process. Respectability was at the heart of the struggle. In Victorian society, clean clothing was a sign of discipline, morality, and class. A man in a crisp white shirt, a woman in a spotless apron, these were symbols of propriety. Dirty or stained clothes marked someone as careless, lazy, or poor, regardless of how hard they had tried to stay clean. This meant that women, who bore the responsibility for laundry, carried the weight not just of fabric, but of family reputation. A poorly laundered household was seen as a reflection of a woman's character, and gossip could spread quickly. There was also a divide between how often different classes could wash their clothes. The wealthy could afford frequent laundering and multiple changes of linen. They had wardrobes filled with garments, so each item could be worn once and then sent away to be cleaned. The poor had far fewer clothes, often wearing the same garments for days or weeks before washing was possible. When they did wash, it often meant scrubbing until fabric frayed, because replacing garments was too costly. Cleanliness, therefore, became another marker of class, an endless cycle where the poor were judged for being dirty even as they lacked the resources to keep up. We can picture laundry day in a modest Victorian home. Buckets of water are hauled from the pump. Fires are lit under great pots and the room fills with steam. Shirts and stockings soak while children run underfoot, getting in the way. A mother bends over a tub, her hands red and chapped from soap and hot water, scrubbing until her back aches. Hours later, wet garments are wrung out, hung on lines strung across the kitchen, dripping steadily onto the floor. By night, the house smells of damp cloth and smoke, and everyone is exhausted. Yet, by morning, the family has fresh clothes to wear, and for a short time, respectability is restored. For a wealthy family, the scene is different but no less demanding for the workers involved. Servants labor in the laundry room, lifting steaming sheets, pressing them with heavy irons, and stacking them neatly. The mistress of the house may never touch the soap herself, but her reputation depends on the work of those unseen hands. When guests arrive, the spotless linen on the table, the fresh sheets on the beds, and the crisp clothing of the family all silently announce their refinement and wealth. Laundry was, in its own way, a kind of invisible labor. Its results were seen everywhere, on clothes, in homes, and public impressions, but the work itself was hidden, carried out in hot rooms or by riversides. For women, especially working-class women, it was both a duty and a burden, one that consumed time and strength. Reformers of the age often spoke about public health, sanitation, and clean water, but they rarely mentioned the endless labor of laundry, even though it was central to Victorian hygiene. Looking back, the struggles of laundry reveal how much cleanliness cost, not only in money, but in labor and pain. Every clean shirt and spotless dress represented hours of boiling, scrubbing, wringing, and pressing. The crispness of Victorian fashion, so admired in portraits and novels, was made possible only by this hidden work. It reminds us that hygiene was never easy, and for the Victorians it was often a battle fought one shirt, one sheet, and one aching back at a time. Perfume in the Victorian era was not just a luxury. It was often a practical solution to an unavoidable problem. With bathing rare, laundry exhausting, and the streets filled with foul odors, many people turned to fragrance as a way to mask the smells of daily life. Soap was expensive and hard to use in abundance, but a dab of perfume or a sprinkle of scented water could give the impression of freshness without the need for a full wash. In this way, perfume became a kind of invisible clothing, a layer of protection between the body and the judgment of others. Scents had always been popular among the wealthy, but in the 19th century, they became more widely available thanks to advances in chemistry and mass production. Still, good perfume remained expensive, and owning a bottle signaled refinement and status. For those who could not afford fine French imports, there were cheaper imitations or simple floral waters made from roses, lavender, or violets. Even these lighter scents carried meaning, suggesting not only cleanliness but also respectability. A person who smelled of flowers was assumed to be polished, while someone who smelled of sweat or smoke risked being seen as careless or uncouth. The use of perfume extended beyond the body. Handkerchiefs were often scented, tucked into pockets or handbags so that one could raise them to the nose when confronted with unpleasant smells. Women carried vinaigrettes, small decorative containers filled with scented sponges or vinegar-based solutions, to ward off odors in the streets. A lady walking through a crowded market might press a perfumed handkerchief to her face, not only to protect her senses but also to display her refinement. Men, too, used colognes, splashing them on after shaving or before social events. The association of scent with sophistication was strong, and to smell of lavender or citrus was to place oneself firmly in the realm of the respectable. At the same time, perfume had its critics. Some moralists warned against excessive use, suggesting that it was a form of vanity or even deception. If one relied on scent to cover dirt, critics argued, then it was no substitute for true cleanliness. But for many Victorians, the choice was not between perfume and a bath. It was between perfume and the unavoidable odors of their environment. When water was difficult to heat, when laundry was backbreaking, and when the streets themselves stank of waste, perfume was the easier, quicker solution. There was also an element of romance and allure tied to scent. Literature of the time often described heroines by the fragrance that lingered around them, as if perfume were part of their character. A trace of rosewater or violet suggested purity, delicacy, and femininity. A stronger musk or exotic spice hinted at mystery and seduction. Men's colognes, meanwhile, were tied to strength and confidence. In a world where physical closeness was often unavoidable, carriages, parlors, and crowded theaters, scent became part of how people presented themselves, a tool as powerful as clothing or manners. In wealthier homes, perfume was woven into the daily routine. Dressing tables held bottles of rosewater and cologne, ready to be dabbed behind the ears or on wrists. Linen closets sometimes included sachets of lavender or dried herbs, so that clothing carried a faint, pleasant smell when worn. Even soaps, for those who could afford them, were often scented, turning a rare bath into a fragrant experience. Perfume was not just for masking odors. It was part of a broader culture of refinement, a way to turn hygiene into an art. In poorer households, perfume was a rare luxury, but the desire for scent remained. Cheaper colognes and floral waters could be bought in small amounts, and even these were treasured. A young woman might save for a tiny bottle of lavender water to dab on her handkerchief, using it sparingly to make it last. For others, simple remedies were used. Fresh herbs tucked into clothing, or vinegar mixed with water to create a sharp but cleansing scent. These improvised perfumes may not have carried the prestige of imported French fragrances, but they still offered the same small relief from the smells of daily life. The popularity of perfume was also fueled by advertising. Companies promoted their scents in newspapers and posters, linking fragrance to health, beauty, and social success. Some ads promised that a particular perfume would make a woman irresistible, or give a man an air of distinction. Others claimed that scented waters could ward off illness by purifying the air. In a society that feared disease carried by foul smells, perfume was more than vanity. It was protection. To wear scent was to shield oneself, not only from judgment, but from danger. Yet, perfume could only do so much. A dab of lavender water might cover the smell of sweat for a time, but it could not replace soap and water. People knew this, but many accepted the compromise. Life was dirty, and true cleanliness was difficult to achieve. Perfume allowed people to present themselves as refined, even when their circumstances made washing difficult. It was a kind of illusion, but an important one in a culture that valued appearances so highly. Imagine a Victorian ball. The air is thick with the mingled scents of perfumes, rose, violet, citrus, musk, masking the reality that few of the dancers had bathed that day. Women glide in gowns that brush the floor, their hair pinned with flowers and scented oils. Men bow with a trace of cologne still lingering from their morning routine. Together, they create an atmosphere of elegance, where fragrance becomes part of the performance. Beneath the surface, the struggles of hygiene remain, but for one evening, the illusion holds. Perfume in the Victorian era was in many ways a bridge between the dirty realities of daily life and the ideals of refinement and beauty. It allowed people to navigate a world of foul-smelling streets, rare baths, and endless laundry while still appearing respectable. It was both a comfort and a disguise, a reminder that sometimes appearances mattered as much as reality. Looking back, we can see perfume not just as a luxury, but as an essential tool in the Victorian struggle for cleanliness, dignity, and social survival. Public baths and washhouses were among the most important reforms of the Victorian age, because they offered ordinary people something that had long been out of reach, a real chance to be clean. For centuries, bathing had been a luxury of the wealthy, with their private tubs and servants to heat the water. The poor, crowded into city tenements or rural cottages, managed only with basins of cold water and the occasional scrub in a tin tub. But as public concern for health grew, and as reformers began to push for better living conditions, public baths and washhouses appeared as a solution. They were more than just buildings. They were symbols of progress, of dignity, and of a new understanding that cleanliness was not a luxury, but a necessity. The rise of these institutions was closely tied to the growth of cities. By the mid-19th century, places like London, Manchester, and Liverpool were bursting with workers who had moved from the countryside to the city in search of jobs. They lived in small, crowded rooms, often with no access to running water and no space for proper washing. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread quickly in such conditions, and reformers saw that the lack of hygiene was not just a personal problem, but a public one. Cleanliness could no longer be left to individual effort alone. It had to be supported by public facilities. Washhouses were designed to give working-class families a place to do laundry in a cleaner, more efficient way than at home. They provided large basins, hot water, and space for drying, which saved women the exhausting work of carrying water, boiling it at home, and hanging clothes in cramped, smoky rooms. For many women, these washhouses were a blessing, offering not just relief from the drudgery of laundry, but also a chance to socialize with neighbors. Rows of women would scrub and rinse side by side, exchanging stories and gossip as they worked. The washhouse was as much a community center as it was a place for cleanliness. Public baths, meanwhile, gave people the opportunity to wash themselves in ways they never could at home. Some facilities had large communal pools, modeled after ancient Roman baths, where men and women, in separate sections of course, could immerse themselves fully. Others offered private cubicles with tubs or showers where individuals could bathe in privacy. For a small fee, workers could enjoy hot water, soap, and a clean towel, luxuries they rarely had access to in their own homes. To step into one of these baths after weeks of only sponge washes must have felt like a rebirth. The design of these establishments reflected Victorian values. They were often built in a dignified, almost grand style, with brick facades, high windows, and separate entrances for men and women. The goal was not only to provide washing facilities, but also to instill pride and respectability. Reformers wanted the poor to feel that bathing was not shameful or indulgent, but proper and moral. Cleanliness was linked to health, yes, but also to virtue. A clean worker was thought to be more disciplined, more reliable, and more respectable than a dirty one. At first, not everyone welcomed these facilities. Some people resisted the idea of paying to bathe, especially when money was already tight. Others felt embarrassed about washing in public, even with separate sections. There were also cultural habits to overcome. Many Victorians had grown up believing that frequent bathing was unnecessary or even harmful. Reformers had to persuade people that regular washing was both safe and desirable. Over time, as more people experienced the comfort of hot water and the relief of true cleanliness, the popularity of public baths grew. We can imagine a Saturday evening in a Victorian city when workers finished their week and headed to the local public baths. Men carried towels and soap in small bundles, waiting in line for their turn in the steamy rooms. Children splashed in shallow pools, their laughter echoing off tiled walls. Women scrubbed clothes in the wash-house, their voices rising in conversation as they wrung out heavy sheets and hung them to dry. The air was thick with the smell of soap, steam, and damp linen, but there was also a sense of pride. For a small coin, people could leave behind the grime of the streets and feel, for once, truly clean. The introduction of public baths and washhouses also had a ripple effect on society. Employers noticed when their workers appeared cleaner, and some even encouraged or subsidized the use of baths. Schools began teaching children about the importance of hygiene, reinforcing habits that were easier to practice when facilities were available. Slowly, the idea that regular bathing was part of everyday life began to spread. By the end of the Victorian era, the concept of weekly or even more frequent baths was becoming more accepted, paving the way for the modern expectation of daily washing. It is worth noting that these facilities also highlighted social divisions. While they were designed to help the poor, wealthier families rarely needed them. The upper classes had private bathrooms fitted with tubs, running water, and eventually even flush toilets. Public baths, then, were often seen as places for the working class, a reminder of the unequal access to comfort. Yet, at the same time, they represented a step toward greater equality. For the first time, even the poorest Londoner could, for the price of a penny, enjoy a hot bath in surroundings that suggested dignity rather than squalor. Looking back, public baths and washhouses were more than just practical solutions. They were milestones in the history of hygiene. They showed that society could come together to solve problems of health and cleanliness, that progress was possible even in the face of poverty and overcrowding. They also remind us that the habits we take for granted today, daily showers, washing machines, clean clothing, were built on the efforts of reformers who believed that everyone deserved the dignity of being clean. For the Victorian worker who left a washhouse with clean linen, or the child who stepped out of a public bath with wet hair and warm skin, these places must have felt like oases in a harsh world. They offered not just hygiene, but comfort, pride, and the hope of a better life. In their tiled walls and steaming basins, we see the first real steps toward the modern understanding that cleanliness is not a luxury, but a right. Corsets were one of the most defining features of Victorian fashion, and while they shaped the body into the narrow, elegant silhouette that society admired, they also made hygiene a constant challenge. To us today, the idea of wearing a tightly laced garment every day, sometimes for hours on end, already seems uncomfortable. But for Victorian women, the corset was not only about beauty, it was about respectability, discipline, and status. The cost of that respectability, however, was sweat, difficulty keeping clean, and the constant presence of clothing that pressed against the skin in ways that trapped dirt and odor. A corset was made of sturdy fabric, often cotton, linen, or silk, reinforced with whalebone or steel stays. It was designed to fit snugly, pulling in the waist and supporting the bust. Women wore them over chemises, which were meant to absorb sweat and protect the corset from direct contact with the body. But even with this layer, corsets absorbed odors over time, especially in hot weather or during long social events. They were not easy to wash. Unlike a chemise, which could be laundered weekly, corsets were stiff and complicated to clean, and frequent washing could damage their structure. This meant that many women simply aired them out between uses, relying on perfumes, powders, and fresh chemises to keep them tolerable. The difficulty of cleaning corsets reflected a larger problem in Victorian hygiene. Clothing itself was often an obstacle to freshness. Women wore multiple layers, chemises, petticoats, corsets, bodices, skirts, that made bathing less frequent and laundering more complicated. Removing and reassembling all these garments was time-consuming, especially for women who required assistance from maids to dress. As a result, daily washing of the body was rare, and much of the effort went instead into keeping clothing fresh on the surface. A woman might smell of lavender sachets tucked into her skirts, while beneath the layers, sweat and dust remained. Corsets also physically restricted the body in ways that affected hygiene. Laced tightly, they made it difficult to breathe deeply, to bend, or even to eat comfortably. They pressed on the stomach and ribs, limiting movement and sometimes causing discomfort or fainting. With such restrictions, vigorous washing or bathing was even less practical. Imagine trying to bend over a basin of water or scrub your arms while wearing something that held your torso stiffly in place. This is why undergarments were so important. They were easier to wash and acted as a buffer between the body and the corset. Still, the system was imperfect, and odors were difficult to fully manage. For poorer women, corsets were often less rigid, sometimes homemade, and not worn as tightly. Practical labor required freedom of movement, and laundresses, maids, or factory workers could not afford to faint on the job. But even these lighter corsets were hard to clean and added another layer to the already difficult task of staying fresh. In crowded tenements, with limited access to water and laundry facilities, corsets could become grim reminders of social ideals that were almost impossible to meet. To be properly dressed meant to be constrained, both physically and hygienically. The wealthy, by contrast, could afford multiple corsets, rotating them so that one could rest or air out while another was worn. They also had maids to manage the cleaning process and to lace them tightly each morning. A lady of fashion might have corsets in different colors to match her gowns, or lighter corsets for day and stiffer, more elaborate ones for evening. But even for her, the issue of hygiene remained. A long evening at a ball, spent dancing under gas lamps in a crowded room, could leave both the body and the corset damp with sweat. Perfume and powders covered the evidence, but true freshness was elusive. Corsets also carried symbolic weight in the conversation about hygiene and morality. To wear a corset was to show self-control and refinement, to keep the body disciplined and contained. A woman without a corset risked being judged as careless or improper. This meant that even if corsets made hygiene more difficult, most women accepted them as necessary. The discomfort and inconvenience were outweighed by the social cost of appearing undisciplined. Cleanliness and respectability were tied not only to soap and water but also to the garments that shaped the body. Doctors and reformers sometimes warned of the health risks of tight lacing, pointing out that corsets compressed the lungs, displaced organs, and weakened muscles. Some linked them to fainting, poor digestion, or even long-term illness. But others defended them, arguing that corsets supported the body and improved posture. In this debate, hygiene was often overlooked, but it was an unspoken part of the problem. If a corset limited movement and trapped sweat, then it was not only a fashion concern, but a hygienic one. The body beneath the corset was harder to wash, harder to ventilate, and harder to keep fresh. We can imagine the daily routine of a Victorian woman. In the morning, her maid helps her into her chemise and then laces her corset snugly. She dresses in layers, adjusting skirts and bodices until her silhouette is perfect. Throughout the day, she moves carefully, conscious of the tightness around her waist. In the evening, when the corset is finally unlaced, she exhales with relief, but the marks on her skin and the dampness of her underclothes remind her of the effort it took to maintain this image. Her chemise goes to the wash, but the corset is hung to air, still carrying traces of the day's exertion. For men, hygiene was simpler, but they too wore constraining garments, stiff collars, waistcoats, and tailored coats that trapped heat and restricted movement. They often relied on starched shirts to absorb sweat, changing them more frequently than bathing. But it was the corset that most clearly symbolized the link between fashion and hygiene, showing how the demands of respectability could complicate the simplest acts of cleanliness. Looking back, corsets and cleanliness remind us that hygiene is never just about health. It is also about culture, fashion, and social expectations. Victorian women did not wear corsets because they were practical or comfortable. They wore them because society demanded it, and in doing so they accepted the difficulties that came with keeping both body and garment clean. Today, when we think of corsets, we often focus on the silhouette they created, but behind that narrow waist was a daily struggle with sweat, odors, and the limits of washing. Hygiene, like fashion, was shaped as much by appearances as by reality. Victorian hair care was one of the most fascinating parts of hygiene, because while hair was seen as a crowning glory, keeping it clean was anything but easy. Daily washing of hair, as we know it today, was not common. In fact, for many Victorians, washing their hair with water and soap was something done only once every few weeks, sometimes even less often. This wasn't simply a matter of laziness. It was because the products, methods, and cultural expectations of the time made frequent washing difficult, and in some cases, even undesirable. For women, long hair was a sign of beauty and femininity. A proper Victorian lady was expected to have thick, healthy locks, often worn up during the day in elaborate styles and let down at night to be brushed. Washing such long hair was an ordeal. Water was heavy to carry and slow to heat, and soap was expensive and often harsh. Many of the soaps available were not designed for delicate hair. They stripped oils, left residue, and made hair feel stiff. Because of this, most women preferred to clean their hair in other ways, through brushing, oiling, and perfuming rather than through full washing. Brushing was central to Victorian hair care. Women were advised to brush their hair dozens, even hundreds of strokes each night. This was believed to distribute natural oils from the scalp along the length of the hair, keeping it shiny and healthy. Brushing also helped remove dust and dirt, which was unavoidable in cities filled with soot, coal smoke, and dirty streets. A woman sitting at her dressing table with a silver-backed brush, patiently working through her long tresses, was a familiar image of the time. It was not only grooming, but also a form of self-care, a ritual that connected hygiene with beauty and discipline. To freshen the hair between washes, Victorians relied on powders and oils. Hair powders, often made from starch or rice flour, were sprinkled onto the scalp to absorb grease and odor. This is not so different from modern dry shampoo, though the effect could leave hair pale or dusty if overused. Oils, such as castor oil or pomades scented with flowers, were applied to give shine and control. These products masked smells, tamed frizz, and added a polished look, even if the hair itself was not truly clean. For wealthy women, perfumed oils were a luxury, part of the elaborate routine of maintaining appearances. For the poor, even a bit of lard or plain oil might be pressed into service to keep hair manageable. Men's hair care was somewhat simpler, but still important. A respectable Victorian gentleman kept his hair neatly trimmed, oiled, and parted. Pomades made from bear grease or other animal fats were popular early in the century, later replaced by petroleum-based products. These gave hair a glossy, controlled look, which matched the neatness expected of men's fashion. Beards and mustaches, which became fashionable in the mid-Victorian years, also required care. Men used oils and waxes to keep their facial hair tidy, while barbers offered shaves and trims to maintain a polished appearance. Like women, men were judged by their grooming, and unkempt hair was seen as a sign of disorder or low status. The problem of lice and dandruff was another challenge. With infrequent washing, infestations were common, especially among children in crowded households. Remedies ranged from vinegar rinses to combing with fine-toothed lice combs, sometimes combined with herbal treatments. Dandruff, meanwhile, was fought with oils, tonics, or special powders sold by chemists. Advertisements for hair products often promised not only beauty but also health, claiming to cure baldness, strengthen roots, and eliminate pests. Some of these claims were little more than marketing, but they reveal how much Victorians worried about their hair. Hair also carried social meaning. A woman's long hair was tied to her identity. Cutting it short was often associated with illness, disgrace, or punishment. Clean, glossy hair suggested moral discipline and good health, while tangled or dirty hair hinted at carelessness or poverty. For men, a full head of hair symbolized vigor, while baldness was often mocked or feared as a sign of weakness. Hair was not just personal, it was cultural, reflecting both hygiene and social values. We can imagine a Victorian evening in a middle-class household. A young woman sits by the fire, her hair let down after a day of being pinned up. She takes her brush and begins the long process of smoothing her locks, counting strokes as she goes. Her sister sprinkles a little lavender-scented powder onto her scalp, working it in with her fingers to freshen the smell. Across town, a man at his dressing table dips his comb into a small tin of pomade, slicking his hair neatly before heading to a dinner party. Meanwhile, in a working-class tenement, a mother patiently combs through her children's hair with a fine comb, searching for lice under the dim light of a candle. In each case, the routines differ, but the goal is the same: to keep hair respectable in a world where true cleanliness is hard to achieve. For the wealthy, hair care could even involve professionals. Ladies might visit hairdressers who specialized in elaborate styles, using ribbons, braids, and even false hair to create fashionable looks. Wigs and hairpieces were popular among both men and women, offering a way to achieve fullness or length that nature had not provided. These too required maintenance, cleaning, and scenting, adding yet another layer to the complex relationship Victorians had with hygiene and appearance. Looking back, Victorian hair care seems like a world of contradictions. People prized glossy, beautiful hair, yet washed it rarely. They associated hair with health and morality, yet relied on powders and perfumes to mask its true state. They valued the natural shine of oils, yet often achieved it through animal fat or petroleum products. It was a system shaped by the limits of technology, the cost of soap and water, and the cultural importance of appearance. In the end, Victorian hair care reminds us that hygiene is never just about health. It is also about identity, respectability, and the effort to control how the world sees us. Each brush stroke, each dab of oil, and each sprinkle of powder was part of a daily struggle to appear clean and proper in an age when true cleanliness was hard to achieve. Hair was not just hair. It was a reflection of who you were, of how disciplined, respectable, and refined you appeared to be. Shared beds were a normal part of life for many Victorians, and they reveal a side of hygiene that we rarely think about today. In a time when space was limited, families were large, and resources were scarce, the idea of everyone having their own private bed was often impossible. Instead, children slept together. Servants shared narrow cots, and in the poorest households, entire families crowded into one mattress. Even in wealthier homes, shared beds were common among children and servants, and visitors might be expected to share as well. This closeness shaped not only comfort but also health and hygiene in daily life. Beds themselves were not always the clean, soft places we imagine. A typical Victorian mattress might be stuffed with straw, horsehair, or feathers. Over time, these fillings absorbed sweat, dirt, and smells, becoming heavy and musty. In homes with little money, mattresses were rarely replaced and only occasionally emptied and restuffed. Sheets and blankets, too, were difficult to launder, as we've seen in earlier chapters, so they were often used for long stretches before being washed. In such conditions, sharing a bed meant sharing odors, lice, and sometimes illnesses as well. For working-class families in crowded cities, the situation could be extreme. Tenement rooms were small, with many people crammed into one or two spaces. Parents and children often shared a single bed, while lodgers, strangers who rented part of the room, might sleep alongside them. Reformers who visited these homes were shocked to find 3 or 4 children in one bed, sometimes sleeping head to toe to make space. In the worst cases, families slept directly on the floor with only a blanket, as proper beds were too costly. Such arrangements made it nearly impossible to maintain cleanliness, and they contributed to the spread of diseases like tuberculosis and influenza. In rural households, space was sometimes less crowded, but shared beds were still the norm. Brothers and sisters often shared until adolescence, and farm workers housed together in barns or cottages slept side by side for warmth. Winter made sharing especially practical. Coal and wood were expensive, and body heat saved lives in cold weather. Cleanliness was a lesser concern compared to survival, though the result was the same. Hygiene was compromised for the sake of necessity. Even in wealthier households, servants almost always shared beds. Maids and footmen were given attic rooms with simple cots, often crowded together, while children in upper-class families might sleep 2 or 3 to a bed until they were old enough for separate rooms. Guests could expect to share as well. Travelers who stayed at inns or boarding houses in the Victorian era were often placed together in beds with strangers, something that seems unthinkable today. The practice was so common that writers of the time rarely commented on it. It was simply the way things were. Bed sharing also connected to the larger problem of pests. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in the warm, crowded conditions of shared bedding. Mattresses were rarely aired or cleaned thoroughly, and infestations were common. Families tried various remedies, dusting mattresses with powders, boiling sheets when possible, hanging bedding out in the sun. But pests always returned. In cities, bedbugs were a notorious nuisance, hiding in cracks and seams and biting at night. For many Victorians, the idea of scratching in bed was as ordinary as brushing teeth in the morning. Despite these difficulties, the bed was still a place of rest and intimacy. Families bonded in the closeness, whispering stories before sleep or sharing warmth under heavy quilts. Children found comfort in lying beside their siblings, even if the mattress sagged and the sheets were scratchy. Parents cherished the moments of quiet at the end of the day, even as they struggled with discomfort. For all its shortcomings, the shared bed was part of the rhythm of Victorian life, a reminder of the balance between necessity and aspiration. We can picture a scene in a working-class London tenement. A single room houses a family of 6. A straw mattress fills one corner covered with a patchwork quilt. The parents settle in with the youngest child between them, while the older children squeeze along the edge. The air is heavy with the smells of the day, coal smoke, damp clothing, unwashed skin, but exhaustion brings sleep anyway. Across town, in a wealthier home, 2 young sisters giggle in their shared bed, their hair brushed and braided for the night, their sheets perfumed with lavender. In the servants' quarters, 3 maids share a narrow space, pulling the blanket tight against the drafty attic air. Each situation is different, but the principle is the same. Beds were shared because they had to be. Over time, reformers began to argue that better sleeping conditions were essential for health. They linked overcrowded beds to the spread of disease and pushed for improved housing. By the late Victorian years, some progress was made, with more attention paid to ventilation, cleanliness, and personal space. Still, for much of the century, shared beds remained the reality for millions of people. Looking back, it's easy to see how hygiene was shaped by sleeping arrangements. The idea of personal space, so natural to us today, was a luxury in the Victorian world. To share a bed was not strange or shameful. It was practical, economical, and often unavoidable. But it also meant that dirt, pests, and sickness passed easily from one person to another. The shared bed tells us much about the compromises of Victorian life. People valued cleanliness and respectability, but survival came first, and in the end, everyone had to make do. The Victorian city was never silent, and it was never scentless. To step outside in London, Manchester, or Birmingham during the 19th century was to enter a world of constant smells, some faint, others overwhelming, but always present. Hygiene was not only about soap and water, it was also about how people lived within the odors that surrounded them every day. In a time before motor cars, modern sewers, or chemical air fresheners, the smell of a city was part of life, and for Victorians, it shaped their sense of health, morality, and civilization itself. The most obvious and unavoidable smell came from the streets. Horses were everywhere, pulling carriages, carts, and omnibuses. Each animal produced several pounds of manure a day, and with thousands of horses working in the city, the result was mountains of waste. Street sweepers worked constantly, but the volume was impossible to control. The smell of dung mixed with mud and rain, producing a thick odor that clung to boots, skirts, and wheels. On hot days, the stench intensified, rising in waves that even the most perfumed handkerchief could not block. But manure was only the beginning. The Thames and other rivers carried sewage and industrial runoff, turning them into sluggish, foul-smelling streams. In poorer neighborhoods, open drains ran alongside houses, carrying human waste, kitchen scraps, and dirty water directly into the streets. Gutters filled with stagnant water, attracting flies and rats, and every breath reminded people of the filth that surrounded them. The Great Stink of 1858 had made the problem impossible to ignore, but even after Bazalgette's sewers improved conditions, the smell of waste never fully disappeared. Factories added their own notes to the urban air. Breweries gave off the yeasty, sour smell of fermenting hops. Tanneries stank of animal hides and chemicals. Gasworks filled the sky with sharp, acrid fumes, while soap factories sent out a strange blend of fat and lye. Each industry had its own odor, and in industrial towns, the air was a patchwork of smells that clung to clothing and hair. Workers carried these scents home with them, and entire districts were known by the industries that defined their atmosphere. Markets, too, were full of smells, both pleasant and foul. Fresh bread, roasting chestnuts, and herbs gave off aromas that tempted passers-by. But fish stalls, butchers' tables, and piles of rotting vegetables quickly soured the air. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, and traders sold their goods as fast as possible before they turned. In summer, the heat sped up decay, filling the air with the smell of sour milk and spoiled meat. For the poor, who could only afford the cheapest cuts or leftover scraps, the scent of food on the edge of rot was an everyday reality. Even homes themselves were filled with odors. Coal fires, the main source of heat and cooking, produced smoke that seeped into curtains, clothes, and hair. Dampness from poor ventilation gave rooms a musty smell, while chamber pots and privies added their own sour notes. In wealthier homes, servants worked hard to combat these smells with perfumes, flowers, and potpourri. Bowls of dried petals sat in parlors, vinegar was sprinkled on floors to freshen them, and linens were scented with lavender sachets. Still, the odors of coal, cooking, and human presence were always near. In working-class homes, there was little relief at all, just the mingling of cooking smells, unwashed bodies, and damp clothing. The Victorians were deeply aware of smells, and they often linked them to morality. Reformers argued that foul odors signaled disorder, laziness, or vice, while fresh, sweet scents were associated with virtue and respectability. The miasma theory of disease, which held that sickness was spread by bad air, reinforced this connection. If foul smells could make you ill, then to keep one's home and body smelling pleasant was both a moral and a medical duty. A clean-smelling person was considered respectable, while a foul-smelling one risked not only scorn, but also suspicion of disease. We can imagine walking down a Victorian street on a summer's day. The air is thick with the smell of horse manure mixed with smoke from nearby chimneys. A fishmonger calls out his wares, the sharp scent of herring competing with the sweet aroma of bread from a bakery. Children run barefoot through gutters filled with stagnant water, the smell rising as they splash. A lady passes by, pressing a perfumed handkerchief to her nose, her lavender scent battling the odor of the street. Around the corner, a brewery adds its sour tang to the mix, while further on, the gasworks release a chemical bite into the air. It is a world of constant, competing smells, each one telling a story of the city's life. Inside homes, the effort to create a pleasant atmosphere never ceased. Wealthy households placed great importance on airing rooms, opening windows when possible, and hanging linens in the sun. Vinegar was used to wash floors, not only for cleanliness but also for its sharp, fresh smell. Perfumed soaps, when affordable, were displayed proudly in washrooms, even if they were rarely used. For the poor, such luxuries were out of reach, and the smell of sweat and smoke dominated daily life. Yet even they made small efforts, hanging herbs, burning incense, or boiling vinegar to cut through the stench. Looking back, the smell of the Victorian city is almost unimaginable to us today. Our world is filled with artificial freshness, air fresheners, deodorants, detergents, that mask the natural odors of life. But for Victorians, smell was inescapable, a constant reminder of both the achievements and the failures of their society. The city's odors told the truth, about waste, about work, about food, about life lived close to the edge of hygiene. In the end, the smell of the Victorian city was not just a nuisance, it was part of what drove reform. The stench of sewage led to modern sewers. The odors of overcrowded housing pushed for better ventilation and urban planning. The smells of spoiled food encouraged progress in refrigeration and public health. Each foul odor was a reminder that the city could not continue as it was, and each improvement brought not only cleaner streets but also cleaner air. Soap in the Victorian age was never just about washing the body. It became a symbol of morality, status, and progress. By the mid to late 19th century, soap manufacturers were no longer simply selling a block of fat and lye. They were selling an idea, one that connected personal cleanliness with virtue and even patriotism. Advertisements filled newspapers, magazines, and shop windows, turning soap into one of the first consumer products to be marketed on a massive scale. The result was that hygiene, once a private matter of necessity, became a public conversation shaped by commerce and social pressure. In the early part of the century, soap was still relatively expensive. Poor families used it sparingly, often saving it for laundry rather than bathing. But industrial advances lowered costs, making soap more widely available. Companies seized the opportunity to promote their products, and they did so not just by promising cleanliness, but by suggesting that cleanliness was a duty. To be clean was to be respectable, disciplined, and civilized. To be dirty was to risk shame, suspicion, and even moral judgment. Advertising campaigns leaned heavily on these ideas, linking soap to virtue in ways that went far beyond the wash basin. One of the most famous examples was Piers's soap, which used elaborate advertisements to convince Victorians that its product was essential for modern life. Piers' campaigns often featured smiling, rosy-cheeked children or elegant women, their skin fair and spotless, their hair shining. The message was clear. To be attractive, healthy, and socially acceptable, one needed Piers soap. Some ads even suggested that soap could bring success in love or improve one's chances in society. Soap was transformed from a simple tool into a gateway to refinement. The moral undertones of these ads were unmistakable. Cleanliness had long been tied to ideas of morality. "Cleanliness is next to godliness" was a popular phrase of the time, and advertisers built on this. Soap was presented as a way to cleanse not only the body but also the soul, a way to show discipline and purity. Dirty skin, by contrast, implied laziness, carelessness, or even sin. These associations created enormous social pressure. A housewife who failed to keep her children and husband looking clean risked being judged as neglectful. A man with grimy hands and a muddy collar might be seen as untrustworthy. Soap manufacturers encouraged these judgments because they kept customers buying. The power of advertising extended beyond Britain. As the empire expanded, soap companies linked their products to the civilizing mission. Some campaigns portrayed soap as a tool of empire, suggesting that British soap could civilize colonized peoples by teaching them the virtue of cleanliness. These ads, deeply rooted in racist attitudes, showed dark-skinned figures being washed into whiteness, as if soap itself carried moral and cultural superiority. It was a disturbing reflection of how hygiene was weaponized as an idea, tied to notions of empire and domination. For ordinary Victorians, the effect of all this advertising was that soap became more than a practical purchase. It was an investment in reputation. Shops displayed brightly packaged bars, and families who could afford it chose well-known brands to signal refinement. Children grew up surrounded by images of soap as a necessity, something no proper household could be without. Even the poor, who struggled to buy enough food, were encouraged to see soap as essential, because the shame of dirt was too heavy a burden to carry. We can imagine a Victorian mother standing at a shop counter, debating whether to spend her limited pennies on bread or on a bar of soap. The bread would feed her children, but the soap might help them look respectable at school or church, protecting them from gossip. In another part of town, a wealthy woman arranges scented soaps in her washroom, proud of their pastel colors and embossed names, confident that they add to the impression of refinement in her household. In both cases, soap is not only about washing, it is about identity and how others perceive it. The pressure extended into literature and art as well. Novels described heroines with clear, clean skin, often as a sign of their inner purity. Satirical pieces mocked characters who were dirty or unwashed, using filth as a shorthand for vice. Even children's books taught lessons about cleanliness, equating soap and water with good behavior. It was not enough to be clean. One had to be seen as clean, and soap was the means to achieve it. For advertisers, the success was remarkable. Soap became one of the most heavily marketed products of the Victorian age, and the techniques developed to sell it, bright imagery, emotional appeals, moral pressure, laid the groundwork for modern advertising. It was one of the first products to be branded, one of the first to use celebrity endorsements, and one of the first to reach global markets. In selling soap, companies also sold the idea that consumption itself was tied to virtue and identity. Looking back, we can see how powerful these messages were. Victorians lived in a world where true cleanliness was often hard to achieve. Baths were rare, laundry was exhausting, and streets were filthy. Soap alone could not solve these problems, but advertising convinced people that it could, or at least that it could help them appear clean. And appearance was often enough. To smell of lavender soap, to carry a bar of Pears in the washroom, to have children with freshly scrubbed faces. These small things mattered enormously in a society obsessed with respectability. The story of soap in the Victorian age is not just about hygiene. It is about how cleanliness was shaped by commerce, morality, and social pressure. It reminds us that even the most ordinary objects can carry powerful meanings, and that what we buy is often as much about identity as it is about necessity. For the Victorians, soap was not only a bar in the hand, it was a statement, a promise, and sometimes even a judgment. Body odor was one of the most persistent challenges of Victorian hygiene. Today, with deodorants, daily showers, and washing machines, we take it for granted that most people can manage sweat and smell. But for Victorians, this was far from easy. Their world was one of heavy clothing, limited bathing, and endless physical labor, all carried out in environments filled with soot, coal smoke, and crowded bodies. In such conditions, body odor was inescapable, and how people dealt with it tells us a great deal about the culture of cleanliness at the time. One of the biggest differences was that deodorants, as we know them, did not exist. The first modern antiperspirant would not be invented until the very late 19th century, and even then it took years before such products became widely available or trusted. Instead, Victorians relied on other methods. They washed when they could, changed underclothes if possible, and used powders, perfumes, and scented waters to mask odors. But none of these methods eliminated the root cause of sweat. And for many, the smell of unwashed bodies was simply part of daily life. Clothing played a crucial role in how people managed odor. The chemise, worn close to the skin, was meant to absorb sweat and keep outer garments cleaner. These underclothes could be laundered more often than dresses or coats, though more often still usually meant weekly rather than daily. For men, shirts served the same purpose. A fresh white shirt was a symbol of respectability, not only because it looked neat, but because it suggested the wearer had changed his underlayer recently, reducing odors. But for the poor, who owned only a few garments, changing was less frequent, and smells built up quickly. Perfume and powders were the main tools for masking odor. Women sprinkled scented powders under their arms or on their chemises, using lavender, rose, or violet fragrances. Vinegar washes were also popular, believed to cut through sweat and refresh the skin, though the sharp smell of vinegar sometimes lingered. Perfumes and colognes were dabbed on wrists, necks, or handkerchiefs, creating a cloud of fragrance that distracted from less pleasant scents. In crowded places like theaters, balls, or carriages, the mix of perfume and body odor created its own atmosphere, one that Victorians learned to navigate with politeness and restraint. The problem was especially acute in summer. Heat made bathing even more desirable but also more difficult, as water supplies could run low and heating water was still costly. People fanned themselves in sweltering drawing rooms, their layers of clothing trapping sweat beneath silk and wool. Social gatherings, meant to be elegant affairs, could easily turn into humid rooms filled with the mingling scents of flowers, perfume, and perspiration. Gentlemen dabbed at their foreheads with handkerchiefs, while ladies discreetly adjusted their gowns to cool themselves. To avoid embarrassment, many carried small bottles of scent or vinaigrettes, ready to refresh themselves at a moment's notice. For the working classes, body odor was unavoidable. Laborers sweated in factories, mines, and fields, with little opportunity to wash during the day. At home, crowded living conditions made privacy scarce, and water for bathing scarce as well. Families did what they could, rinsing with basins, wiping with cloths, or changing linen when possible. But the smell of sweat clung to both bodies and homes, mingling with smoke and cooking odors. Reformers often used these smells as evidence of poverty and neglect, though in truth the poor had little choice. Their world made it nearly impossible to stay fresh. The wealthy, while better able to manage odor, were not immune. Even in grand houses, daily bathing was rare, and sweat accumulated under layers of clothing. Servants worked constantly to launder undergarments, brush outer clothes, and air out rooms, but smells lingered nonetheless. In many households, windows were thrown open each morning to let in fresh air, while flowers and herbs were placed in rooms to provide natural fragrance. For the mistress of the house, smelling pleasant was a mark of refinement, and she relied on her servants, perfumes, and frequent changes of linen to maintain the illusion of freshness. Victorians were highly sensitive to smell, and body odor carried social meaning. A clean, fresh-smelling person was assumed to be disciplined and respectable, while foul odors suggested laziness, illness, or moral weakness. The link between smell and morality was strengthened by the popular belief in miasma, the idea that disease was spread through foul air. To smell bad was not only unpleasant, it was dangerous. People avoided those who stank, fearing not just discomfort, but contagion. This fear pushed people to mask odors however they could, even if true cleanliness was beyond reach. We can imagine a typical day. A young clerk hurries to work in London, dressed in his best suit. His shirt is freshly laundered, but beneath it, sweat begins to gather as he walks through crowded streets. At the office, he dabs his forehead and hopes his cologne covers any trace of odor. In a nearby tenement, a woman rinses her children's faces and hands in a basin, wiping away the worst of the grime, but unable to erase the smell of unwashed bodies in a cramped room. Across town, at a ball, a lady glides across the floor, her gown rustling, her hair perfumed with rose oil. She smiles gracefully, even as the heat makes her corset damp beneath her silk dress. Each of these moments reflects the same truth. Sweat and smell were universal, even if how they were managed varied by class. Body odor in the Victorian age was a constant reminder of the gap between ideals and reality. Cleanliness was praised in sermons, literature, and advertisements, but the practical means of staying fresh were limited. People did their best with the tools they had, relying on linen, perfume, powders, and the occasional bath. Still, the smell of unwashed bodies remained part of the fabric of daily life, something accepted, endured, and sometimes judged. Looking back, we can see how much the Victorians valued appearances, even when reality fell short. They lived in a world where true freshness was rare, but they created rituals and products to mask the truth. The problem of body odor was not solved until much later, with the invention of modern deodorants and the spread of daily bathing. For the Victorians, it was a battle fought every day, one that revealed just how complicated the quest for cleanliness really was. Victorian smiles were not always as bright and polished as portraits and novels might suggest. Dental hygiene in the 19th century was still in its infancy, and while people cared deeply about appearances, keeping teeth clean and healthy was a constant struggle. Without modern toothbrushes, toothpaste, and dentistry, the Victorians relied on tooth powders, homemade remedies, and sheer determination to maintain their smiles. What they achieved was often less about health and more about keeping up the image of respectability in a society where appearances mattered so much. Tooth powder was the main tool for cleaning teeth. Unlike the smooth, minty toothpaste we squeeze from tubes today, Victorian tooth powder was often gritty, homemade, and flavored in ways that might surprise us. Recipes included crushed chalk, powdered charcoal, finely ground brick, or even burnt breadcrumbs, all meant to scrub away stains. Some powders contained salt or baking soda for their cleaning effect, while others added herbs like mint, clove, or sage for a fresher taste. Wealthier families might buy fancy tooth powders from chemists, packaged in small decorative tins, while poor households made their own mixtures at home. Brushing was done with toothbrushes that looked familiar but were far cruder than modern ones. Handles were made of wood, ivory, or bone, and bristles were often coarse animal hair, usually from pigs. These brushes wore down quickly, and the bristles sometimes came loose during use, leaving an unpleasant surprise in the mouth. Nevertheless, brushing with powder was encouraged in magazines and advice manuals, especially for women, who were expected to maintain an appearance of health and beauty at all times. A bright smile was tied to refinement, even if dental science had not yet caught up with the ideal. Despite these efforts, tooth decay was widespread. Diets were changing, and sugar consumption was increasing rapidly thanks to the growing availability of tea, jam, and sweetened foods. Children were particularly vulnerable, as their teeth were exposed to sugary treats, but their families often lacked the means for proper dental care. Pain from rotting teeth was common, and extractions were the most frequent solution. Dentists existed, but dentistry was still developing as a profession, and many people could not afford their services. Instead, barbers, blacksmiths, or even traveling tooth pullers performed extractions in public squares, sometimes to the sound of cheering crowds. The experience was often brutal. There were no anesthetics in the early Victorian years, and even when chloroform and ether became available later, they were not always used for dental work. A person with a bad toothache might sit in a chair, gripping the arms tightly while the dentist or barber yanked out the offending tooth with pliers. Relief came only in the sense that the pain was gone, though often at the cost of losing more teeth than necessary. By middle age, it was not uncommon for Victorians, especially from poorer classes, to have several missing teeth. Wealthier individuals had access to more advanced, though still imperfect, solutions. False teeth were in demand, made from ivory, porcelain, or even real human teeth purchased from grave robbers or taken from battlefield corpses. These dentures were expensive and uncomfortable, but they allowed the wealthy to maintain the appearance of a full smile. Some were fitted with springs to hold them in place, but these could snap open at inopportune moments, creating both discomfort and embarrassment. Still, the effort to replace lost teeth shows how much Victorians valued the look of health, even if it meant relying on artificial means. Advice on dental care appeared in magazines and etiquette books, reflecting the importance placed on appearance. Women, in particular, were urged to maintain clean, white teeth as part of their overall beauty. Bad breath was considered a serious social flaw, so people chewed herbs like parsley or cloves to freshen their breath. Mouthwashes, often made with vinegar, alcohol, or herbal infusions, were also recommended. Some concoctions promised to cure toothache, whiten enamel, and sweeten breath all at once, though many were little more than flavored alcohol. Children's dental care was a growing concern, though practices were often inconsistent. Parents might encourage brushing with powder, but others believed children's baby teeth did not need much care since they would fall out anyway. Schools sometimes promoted cleanliness, including dental hygiene, as part of teaching discipline and health, but access to brushes and powders remained uneven. For many children, toothache was simply part of growing up, endured with little relief. We can picture different scenes across Victorian society. In a wealthy home, a lady sits at her dressing table, dipping a boar bristle brush into a tin of mint-scented tooth powder, carefully scrubbing her teeth before a dinner party. Across town, a working man chews a sprig of sage after supper, hoping to freshen his breath before going to the pub. In a crowded market, a traveling tooth puller puts on a performance, pulling out teeth in front of a gathering crowd, his patients gritting their teeth through the pain while bystanders gasp and cheer. In each setting, teeth are not just about health, they are about survival, appearance, and social identity. By the late Victorian years, dentistry was becoming more professionalized. Dental schools opened, and new tools and techniques improved the care available. Anesthetics made extractions less terrifying, and dental chairs became more specialized. Advertisements for powders and brushes became more sophisticated, promising not just cleanliness, but health and beauty. Still, toothache remained one of the most dreaded and common complaints, a reminder that science had not yet solved the challenges of dental hygiene. Looking back, Victorian dental care reminds us that cleanliness was always a balancing act between ideals and reality. People valued white teeth and fresh breath, but the tools they had were crude, and the solutions were often painful. Tooth powder, brushes, and mouthwashes helped, but decay and tooth loss were widespread. For the Victorians, every smile carried the marks of their struggle with hygiene, hidden behind powders, perfumes, and sometimes even porcelain. The phrase, "the laundry of the body," is a fitting way to describe how Victorians kept themselves clean, because daily showers were not part of life. Instead of stepping into running water each morning as we do today, people relied on a series of small, practical routines to freshen themselves. A full bath was rare, costly, and often inconvenient. So cleanliness was achieved in pieces, with basins, cloths, and occasional immersions, enough to pass in polite society, even if the body was never truly spotless by modern standards. At the heart of Victorian self-care was the washstand. Nearly every home, whether grand or humble, had some version of it. In wealthy houses, a washstand might be made of polished wood, topped with a porcelain basin and pitcher with matching soap dish and towels. In working-class homes, it might be no more than a chipped jug and basin placed on a table. But the principle was the same. Water was poured into the bowl, and the face, hands, and sometimes arms were washed with a cloth or sponge. This sponge bath was the daily norm for many, allowing them to remove dirt and refresh themselves without the trouble of a full bath. Morning routines often began with cold water splashed on the face. Advice manuals praised the invigorating effect, claiming it kept the complexion bright and the body strong. For the wealthy, servants might bring hot water upstairs for a more comfortable wash, but the poor usually relied on what they could fetch themselves, often cold from a pump or shared tap. Hands and face were the priority, since these were most visible to others. A clean face and neatly combed hair gave the impression of respectability, even if the rest of the body had not been washed for days. For more thorough cleaning, people used washcloths to rub down the body in sections. A woman might undress to her chemise, dip a cloth into the basin, and wipe her neck, arms, and chest before drying off and dressing again. Men did the same with chest and underarms, sometimes rinsing their feet at night after a long day in boots. This partial washing, done daily or every few days, was considered sufficient for most. The idea of scrubbing the entire body with soap and water every day would have seemed excessive, even unhealthy to many Victorians. When a deeper wash was needed, people used portable tin baths. These were brought into kitchens or bedrooms, filled with heated water carried in buckets from the stove or fireplace. It was a laborious process, so such baths were often reserved for once-a-week occasions or special needs. Families sometimes shared the same water, each person taking a turn in order of age or importance, with the father or eldest going first. Children followed, and by the time the youngest had their turn, the water was tepid and murky. Though not ideal, it was better than no bath at all. Soap was used sparingly. Harsh soaps could irritate skin, so many people limited their use to hands, faces, and laundry. Instead, some used vinegar or herbal infusions as skin cleansers, believed to refresh and tone the body. Women were especially cautious about soap on the face, fearing it would dry the skin and harm their complexion. Advice columns often suggested rinsing with rosewater or applying creams after washing to keep skin soft. For the poor, soap was precious, and many relied more on water alone, or skipped washing entirely when money or time ran short. Public baths, as discussed earlier, offered a fuller option for those without private facilities. For a small fee, a person could immerse themselves in a warm tub or shower, enjoying a level of cleanliness impossible at home. These visits might be weekly or less depending on affordability, but they provided a chance to scrub properly, sometimes with attendants or brushes to help. Still, most Victorians lived their lives with only occasional full-body washing, supplemented by daily sponging and a strong reliance on clean clothing to maintain respectability. Clothing, in fact, was often considered more important than the body itself. A person might wash their face and hands, change into a fresh shirt or chemise, and appear perfectly clean to others, even if their torso and legs had not been washed in weeks. Clean linen against the skin was thought to draw out dirt and keep the body pure, an idea rooted in older traditions. Laundering was difficult, but it was a visible sign of hygiene, and many people prioritized it over bathing. We can imagine a typical morning in a middle-class home. A young man rises, pours water from a pitcher into the basin, and splashes his face. He rubs his arms and neck with a damp cloth, dries himself briskly, and dresses in a fresh shirt. His mother reminds the maid to boil water for the father's weekly bath that evening. In another household, a working woman hauls a bucket from the pump, pours a little into a cracked basin, and washes her children's faces before school. Their clothes may be patched, but they step out with clean cheeks and brushed hair, ready to face the world respectably. The wealthy had more elaborate routines. A lady might sit at her dressing table while her maid brought warmed water and scented soaps. After a gentle sponging, she applied rosewater, powders, and creams to refresh her skin. She would then dress in layers of linen and silk, confident that her appearance matched society's expectations. Her body may not have been fully washed, but her perfume, her clean clothing, and her radiant skin gave the impression of perfection. Looking back, the laundry of the body shows us how hygiene was a balance of effort, resources, and appearances. True cleanliness as we know it today was rare, but respectability could still be maintained through routine sponging, clean clothes, and the careful use of perfumes and powders. The Victorians lived with odors and dirt in ways we would find shocking, but they also developed rituals that allowed them to navigate their world with dignity. For them, the goal was not absolute purity, but social acceptability. A face washed in cold water, hands scrubbed before meals, a clean shirt against the skin. These were enough to signal discipline and morality. In that sense, the laundry of the body was not just about hygiene. It was about identity, respect, and the constant struggle to appear proper in a world where true cleanliness was hard to achieve. The legacy of Victorian hygiene is all around us, even if we rarely stop to think about it. Many of the habits we now consider ordinary, bathing regularly, brushing our teeth, washing our clothes, keeping our homes fresh, are rooted in the struggles and reforms of the 19th century. The Victorians lived in a world where cleanliness was difficult, expensive, and often incomplete, yet their constant efforts to improve it set the stage for the standards we now take for granted. By the end of the era, the seeds of modern hygiene had been planted, reshaping not only health but also culture and identity. One of the most lasting contributions was the development of public health systems. The Victorians began to see cleanliness not just as a personal virtue, but as a social necessity. Sewers were built, clean water was supplied, and waste management became a matter of civic responsibility. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames reeked so badly that Parliament was forced to act, symbolized a turning point. It showed that filth could no longer be ignored, and that the health of a city depended on the hygiene of all its citizens, rich and poor alike. The public baths and washhouses, the sanitation reforms, and the campaigns for clean streets all carried forward into the 20th century, shaping the infrastructure we still rely on today. Personal hygiene also transformed. While daily bathing was rare in 1850, by 1900 it was becoming more common, especially in middle-class homes with access to indoor plumbing. Soap, once a luxury, became a staple. Tooth powders evolved into toothpaste, brushes improved, and dentistry began to professionalize. Advertisements continued to play a role, but by the end of the century, the link between cleanliness and health was stronger than ever, replacing older ideas of cleanliness as merely moral. Science had caught up with appearances, and hygiene was increasingly tied to medical understanding of germs and disease. Fashion, too, adapted to cleanliness. Heavy Victorian garments gave way to simpler, washable clothing in the early 20th century. Corsets loosened, fabrics became lighter, and laundry became easier with new machines and methods. The emphasis on clean undergarments and regular washing did not disappear. It became the foundation of modern expectations. To this day, the simple act of changing into fresh clothes carries the same weight it did in Victorian times. It signals respectability, discipline, and care for oneself. The obsession with scent also left a mark. While the Victorians relied on perfume and powders to cover odors, we inherited their desire to smell pleasant as part of hygiene. Deodorants, soaps, shampoos, and laundry detergents today are infused with scents that echo those earlier traditions. Lavender, rose, and citrus still dominate our cleaning products, reminders of the herbs and waters Victorians sprinkled into their basins. The difference is that now these scents complement true cleanliness rather than disguise its absence. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorians taught us that hygiene is never just about health. It is also about identity, culture, and social expectation. For them, to be clean was to be respectable, moral, and civilized. Dirt carried not only the risk of disease, but the weight of judgment. These ideas still influence us today, even if we frame them differently. We may talk about freshness, wellness, or professionalism, but underneath lies the same message. Cleanliness shapes how the world sees us. We can imagine a thread running from the washstands of Victorian bedrooms to the gleaming bathrooms of today. Where once water was poured from pitchers into basins, now it flows endlessly from taps. Where once soap was rationed, now shelves overflow with varieties and scents. Where once a weekly bath was a laborious event, now a daily shower is routine. Each of these changes is rooted in the Victorian struggle, in their determination to overcome dirt, odor, and disease with the tools they had. The legacy also reminds us of the contradictions. The Victorians prized cleanliness, but they often failed to achieve it. They surrounded themselves with perfumes and powders while struggling with sewage and disease. They built elaborate rituals of respectability, even as their cities reeked. Yet in those contradictions, progress was made. Their efforts pushed society forward, creating systems and habits that allowed future generations to do better. Looking back, we can see Victorian hygiene not as a story of failure, but as one of transition. It was the era when cleanliness shifted from luxury to necessity, when private habits became public concerns, and when soap, water, and scent became part of everyday identity. Without their struggles, our modern world of hot showers, minty toothpaste, and clean clothes would not exist. The next time you step into a bathroom, turn on a tap, or brush your teeth without a second thought, you are living the legacy of the Victorian age. Their world may have been filled with dirt and odor, but out of it came the foundations of the cleanliness we now consider ordinary. In their washstands, their powders, their perfumes, and their endless battles with filth, the Victorians created the world we live in today, a world where hygiene is no longer shocking, but simply expected. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into the strange world of Victorian hygiene. It's almost hard to imagine how people lived without daily showers, deodorant, or even proper plumbing. Yet, for them, it was just normal life. What's fascinating is how their struggles with soap, baths, and even smells slowly shaped the habits we now see as completely ordinary. The next time you turn on the tap, step into a hot shower, or squeeze toothpaste onto your brush, remember that these little comforts were once luxuries. They were fought for, argued over, and slowly built into daily routines thanks to centuries of trial, error, and reform. The Victorians may have lived in a world we'd consider shockingly dirty, but without them, we wouldn't have the standards of cleanliness we take for granted today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past and want to hear more stories that reveal the hidden, sometimes uncomfortable but always fascinating truths of history, make sure to give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you'd like more episodes like this. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey through the curious, surprising, and sometimes shocking details of everyday life in history. Who knows, our next story might change the way you look at something you do every single day. Thank you for listening, sleep well if you're using this to drift off, and I'll see you in the next episode.